Keeping up with our conversation, we'll try to finally understand after the conversion of Byzantinists into Islam. More accurately, after the formation of Muslim elite. What a country it was, and more importantly, what kind of a society it was, the Ottomans. No one still now states correctly why the Ottoman Empire was formed. Usually, when each new power in the Middle Ages seized some another authority, they used to create a long family tree tracked back to Noah or someone of that kind in order to prove the fact of being given, blessed by God. And the same is here. But what's interesting for us? Firstly, what the situation was like when the capital was already in the hands of Muslim authority, and how everything developed later on. Here, I can say that, again, in the beginning of the 16th century, we come across to a very interesting episode, very well known to us, the configuration of new forces. A new authority was formed in Persia, and if the Ottomans avowed Sunni denomination of Islam, this new authority, the Safavids, created in Persia, avowed Shia. You see two contradicted denominations. It's natural that this would arise a serious problem. The Ottomans, who already had problems with the Europeans, and they were continuing their wars in the territory of Europe, got a new enemy in the east. It's natural that in the eastern part some essential events would evolve, and that really happened. We are going to talk about this now, but before that, I'd just like to draw your attention to a very interesting fact. How did the Ottomans perceive themselves? Both the authorities and the society at large. The history of the 15th century isn't really deep. There are many documents, research, evidences, which let us understand that both the authorities and the society perceives themselves as Romans. The first sultan, whose residence was the capital, Mahmud II, called himself Basileus, the way that Byzantine emperors call themselves. What language did they write in? Greek. And all the letters were being written in Greek. Nothing has changed except the religion. Different researchers bring different evidence, like Turkish historian Halil İnalcık, who states that the Ottoman Empire wasn't Turkish. It was a society with a unique identity. All sultans call themselves Caesars, Caesars of Caesars. French Jean Baudin in the 16th century also wrote that the sultans tended to the status of Roman Caesars. The same was with Mahmud II and Bayezid II, who again call themselves Basileus Basilian, the Roman Caesar. What language did they speak? Greek. There are different documents from the western parts of the empire where the Serbian language is used. Official letters were written in Serbian. Again, there are different Turkish historians who state that factually the Ottoman Empire was an Islamic Rome, the second Rome. Do you know why it is so important? Because we'll see later on how some political, military processes evolved in the eastern part of the empire. Let me show you. Here are mentioned with different colors some different territories that had been occupied in different centuries and joined with the empire from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. This was the same line that existed in the beginning of the 16th century. In reality, not everyone agrees with this, as it wasn't so long because in the 15th century, as stated by me earlier, when Bayezid II was defeated by well-known Tamerlane or Lenk Timur. It's not clear what was happening in the territory of Asia Minor, and especially in the territories toward the east, whether there was any authority or not. Some new Turkic tribes entered there or not, we don't know this. And in the end of 1510, the Safavids' authority was established in the north of Persia. So what happened in Byzantine? In 1512, the Sultan was changed, and an interesting figure in history showed up named Selim I Yavuz. What did the Sultan do? What policy did he begin to establish? Firstly, he set his main issue to fight against the Safavids and got rid of his problems in the European part, and started getting prepared for a war. But what's most significant is that for the first time, Islamic authorities, the Ottomans, had to fight against another Islamic authority. Nothing similar had ever happened before, and that's why it's such an interesting circumstance for the development of the Ottoman Empire. And so he invented a concept of giving a start to a sacred war in order to keep Islamic roots pure. Thus he had to persuade his warriors to fight against another Islamic people as they had been breaking the laws. And he succeeded. In 1514, he launched his military campaign to the east. An interesting thing here, very relevant to our topic. Yavuz's warriors were Christians converted to Islam and were recruited by Europe. The Janissaries and Safavids troops consisted of nomadic Turks called Guzulbash, which means wearing red hats. How is this so significant? The significant thing is that religion of the troops was different. These were Sunni, Western, and Eastern Safavids were Shia. And what does it mean? The Turks were the enemies of the Ottomans, and this is well researched. When they ordered the Ottomans to stay in Rumelia and said that they had nothing to do in Asia, and before the start of the war, all the Turks found in the whole territory of Anatolia had been exterminated. It's a well-known fact that by 1514, the Ottomans had exterminated all the Turks, and they did it by the hand of the Kurds. The Kurds were Sunnis, and they had exterminated to provide a shoulder, and they began to inhabit the Kurds in all these territories. Again, one Turkish historian writes that if the Kurds hadn't been inhabited in those territories, there would be a danger that the eastern parts of the empire could become Turkish. A rather interesting fact, isn't it? We're talking about the Ottoman Empire. We try to understand who nowadays Ottoman Turks are, and we face such facts that before the start of the war in the beginning of the 16th century, 40,000 Turks had been exterminated by the Ottomans. Later on, they occupied the capital of Safavids, the first capital, which was Tabriz. It was a newly formed country. The war between these two countries lasted more than 50 years. The second interesting fact that had its impact both on the Ottoman Empire and the identity of the society is that having solved these problems with the Safavids, Selim Yavuz I declared himself a caliph. In Islamic world, caliph couldn't be declared for a long time. Caliph is a Muslim, a religious leader of all the people. You see what he did? So factually, he put the foundation of the Ottoman Caliphate. And he was as a Sultan Caliph. Neither of these existed before. And what did it lead to? Firstly, it strengthened his thesis of a sacred war and eased the occupation of the Islamic territories up to Egypt. As the troops of the opponent, the Egyptian Mamelukes, also couldn't get oriented whether to fight or not, as they dealt with the Caliph and Islamic troops, and the other side also didn't want to fight. There are many cases when many Janizaris didn't fight, but you see the opposite side also didn't want to fight. And here, he made a clever step. He made the keepers of Mecca and Medina obey him, as the latter were the centers of Islam. It happened in 1516 when they had to obey and pass their keys to Selim. Thus, he legitimized his status of caliph and declared that he would be the keeper of those sacred cities, and under such propaganda, it would be very difficult for an army to resist. Already in 1517, Egypt fell under his leadership. Within a year, they had already occupied so many territories that they had before. You see what I think is an ideological war. And in the end, they established their boundaries and reached to Baghdad, and north of Africa, having all the territories under their obedience. Of course, no one obeyed as much as they did in the central part of the empire, but that fulminant evolvement was the ideological revolution in the Islamic world. I'll repeat myself, saying that everything was based on the idea that everything told by Muhammad happened. The evil vanished and Constantinople fell. These were the warriors of Allah, and with this powerful demagoguery, such interesting processes had been developing. Let's talk specifically about the country. Byzantine governmental system had been preserved. The problem of language was not clear. Neither was what a language was, the one used by the Ottomans for ages, and why its major part was Arabic and Persian. The fact of Arabic is somehow clear, as it was the language of the religion, but it wasn't so much used in governmental life, and why Persian was so spread. Everyone stated that both the structure and 50% of the language are that of Persian ones. There was nothing Turkish, but the presence of the Persian language interests me a lot, and I try to figure out whether the Persians played a much bigger role here than the historians are used to stating. But the more interesting fact was the political structure of the country. There was a sultan, the same caliph. There were also viziers, similar to today's ministers, who governed the whole political system. And there was a religious leader who ruled the whole Islamic world, but in the country there was a leader of a concrete religion community called Mufti. I'm not sure if that word existed in those times, but now this term is widely used. And it's interesting that the people were different. The majority weren't Muslims in Arabic territories, but the eastern parts, yes. But in the central part, most of them were Christians, and in the European part as well. And how did they organize everything? They divided the country into vilayets. It's an Arabic word, which means people. The country was divided into religious communities. Every nation has its own church or synagogue. One of them was Islamic, another was called Rumelia. You see, everywhere existed the word Rome, of the Romans, Christians. The most interesting fact was that there existed an Orthodox community, and Rumelia was indeed an Orthodox community. There were also Armenian and Jewish communities there, 4 in total. Each of them used their language and had some autonomy. They could organize their people's lives, but the religious leader obeyed the sultan. He gave the authority to the church, to the religious institutions, even the right of collecting taxes. This was the structure from the very beginning and until the 19th century. But as Islam was primary and both the domestic and the foreign policy were being implemented under the Islamic flag, people's conditions weren't equal in different vilayets. The Christians didn't have the same rights as the Muslims. They couldn't carry a weapon, ride a horse, and sue a Muslim person. If a Christian had a bigger house, it would be destroyed. It were the Christians who paid taxes. Besides some specific sums, there was a more awful tax called devshirme. The Christians gave their children for the army. Every Christian family had to give a child, and there was reckoning and a deadline. Thus, the army consisted of only Christians. Those children were being converted into Islam and were brought up with an anti-Christian propaganda. The majority of them joined the army, and a small, well-educated part entered the governmental system. Many people state that the government mainly consisted of the Armenians and the Greeks throughout all those ages. And who else could there be? The country was that of the Armenians and of the Greeks. You see how it works. You see what the classical history teaches us and what the reality is. And there are thousands of facts and descriptions of those times, but you cannot collect. The fact is that we dwelt with a society which was described by some figures dating back to the times of Mehmed II, that he had a fantastic plan to combine two religions, Christianity and Islam. And the significant thing is that those people every time used to say that they were the owners of Europe, that they would conquer Europe, that they were looking towards Europe. From the very beginning, after invading the city, Mehmed II declared that he wanted to legalize the Greek language in the country, Greek culture. So he was going in that direction. Later, we'll see why it was so necessary to say all these, as in the end there was a question. We know that at least during 100 years, the Turks have been living in this country. Where did they come from? This is a question, isn't it? And these questions need to be answered. Their scientists and others provide us with all the facts, and they mention that they are different. But how? Accordingly, some very serious processes had been developing, which already led to the fact that during 100 years, in the territory of Turkey, the Turks lived mainly. We need to understand it well, as I'll repeat myself saying that in Armenia, people talk about the Turks more than about the Armenians. But does the majority know where they come from? I'm not sure. We'll touch upon these questions.